Welcome everybody. This is the WMO High Impact Weather webinar on communicating about high impact weather and the role of communicating uncertainty, trust and beliefs. My name is Sally Potter. I'm from GNS Science in New Zealand and I'll be facilitating and sharing this webinar series. So a huge welcome to everybody. And I'm very excited that we've got such a global audience today from both the audience and the panelists. It's a really important challenge that we need to address about communicating uncertainty and the role of trust and beliefs. I think I've personally been told about it quite a lot from a range of people, from researchers to weather forecasters to emergency managers, and they will say, how are we supposed to communicate uncertainty? Do people want to hear this information or not? And so I think it'll be really good for us to be able to address this through the research program. We'll go around and introduce the panelists shortly. First of all, I'll go through the program for today. Andrea will be giving a presentation about the High Impact Weather Program and the Communication Task Team activities. That will be followed by Dr. Susan Jocelyn from the US, who will be talking about the role of uncertainty and experts. Then we'll be going to Dr. Thomas Cox from Germany, who will be talking about stakeholders and the way that they like to have uncertainty communicated to them. And then finally, we'll have Associate Professor Amisha Mehta from Australia. We'll be talking about trust and a potential project that we'll be working on through the High Weather program. Following each of those presenters, we'll be having a few minutes for questions. And then we'll have at the end a panel discussion where you can contribute questions to that too. Once we've introduced ourselves, we'll get into that. So it's going to take a few minutes before we get started there. I just want you to know that you can use that Q&A function, the chat function on the right there, to put any questions you want for the panelists. You can also give it a try by putting in your name, affiliation and country. So you can start doing that now if you want. You can ask questions during the presentations and also for the panel discussion, and it will be moderated. You can like the comments that are put in there to kind of upvote them. And you can also reply directly to those questions so that we don't have to, try and find the reply further down the list. The webinar, including the content of that Q&A, will be recorded and it will be made publicly available afterwards. This is particularly exciting because no one in the organising team has actually used the Teams live events before. So apologies if there are any kind of rough moments, but we're all learning in this COVID world of presenting online, so wish us all the best for that. So we'll go around the panelists now and introduce ourselves. So I'll go first. I'm the co-lead of the High Weather Communication Task Team. I conduct research, social science research in New Zealand on how people respond to warnings and how best to write those warnings and forecasts. I've done a lot of work with geohazards, including for eruption forecasts and earthquake aftershock forecasts for GNS Science in New Zealand. And I also work with New Zealand's Met Service and work with them on the communication of impact-based weather warnings. So I'll hand over now to Andrea Taylor, my co-host.
Thank you, Sally. My name is Andrea Taylor. I'm an academic at the University of Leeds in the UK. My background is in cognitive psychology, and I apply this to addressing challenges regarding weather and climate risk communication faced by forecasting centres around the world, including the UK Met Office, but also Met services in East and West Africa through the African Swift project. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. On to Susan Jocelyn now, please.
Hello, I'm Susan Jocelyn. I'm from the University of Washington. I'm also a cognitive psychologist, and I study decision-making under uncertainty, in particular how to communicate uncertainty to end users. mainly in the domain of weather, but I've also done work in the context of climate change, and also very recently in the context of communicating risk for COVID-19.
Thank you, Susan. Thomas.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Thomas Cox. I'm from the Department of Geography at LMU Munich, and my work is on the perception and use of uncertainty, and mainly with a focus on emergency management and civil protection units.
Thank you, Thomas. And Amisha.
Good morning from Australia. My name's Amisha Mehta. I specialise in risk and crisis communication, and for the last 8 years have been working with emergency management organisations in Australia to help craft their flood and bushfire warnings to support community trust and positive responsive actions in the response phase of natural hazards, and more recently have partnered with our Bureau of Meteorology to look at how community members respond to weather warnings.
Wonderful, thanks Amisha. And I'd just like to acknowledge Martin Wigman from the World Meteorological Organization, who's done a wonderful job in setting up this event for us and handling all the registration emails, etc. So thank you, Martin. Okay, we're going to kick off now into our first presentation, which is going to be by Andrea, talking about the High Impact Weather Research Program and the Communication Task Team activities. Over to you, Andrea. I can see her frantically getting the content ready. Perhaps while she's doing that, I'll just remind everyone that you can put in your affiliation and your name into the chat function there and have it up, and we'll put it onto the chat function.
Andrea, you're muted.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And good morning, afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. As mentioned, I am Andrea Taylor. And today, as an introduction to this seminar, I'm going to be giving a brief overview of some of the task team activities of the High Impact Weather Project's Communications Task Group. So this task group is jointly led by Sally and myself. And the mission of the High Impact Weather Project on growing resilience through better warnings is to promote cooperative international research to achieve a dramatic increase in resilience to high impact weather worldwide through improving forecasts for timescales of minutes to 2 weeks and enhancing their communication and utility in social, economic and environmental applications. So this is a program that really brings together meteorological science focused on processes, predictability, modelling and verification with impact assessments and social science approaches to evaluation and communication. So it's a really very interdisciplinary program. And reflecting this, we have 5 task teams within HIWeather focused on different areas of what we might be able to think of as the warning value chain. So this goes from predictability and the processes underpinning high impact weather events to multi-scale forecasting of weather hazards in coupled modelling systems, to human hazards, to human impacts, vulnerability and risk to individuals, organisations and societies, to forecast evaluation, both in terms of numeric verification approaches in the forecasting process, to user evaluations of forecast quality and usefulness. And then we come to the work of our task team, the communications task team, where we focus on to achieve more effective responses to forecasts through better communication of hazard risk warnings. So I've got here just a list of the current task team members. As you can see, we are quite spread out around the world, but we're always interested in welcoming new members who are doing work on high impact weather communication, whether they be based in academia, operational centres, public sector, private sector, non-profit sector. So we definitely are always interested in growing the activities of the task team and its membership further with those who share our interest in the communication of high impact weather. So I've just got here a slide giving an overview of some of our past and ongoing activities, as well as some that we would like to develop further. So a couple of years ago, we had a special issue in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, capturing key issues in high impact weather communication, which I'll talk a little more in a second. We have ongoing activity collating training materials for weather communication to host or to link on our high weather communications platform to really provide a point of reference for those looking to develop best practice in this area. The use of social media and non-traditional data sources for communicating about weather. So both using social media for the dissemination of weather forecasts and warnings from forecasters to different audiences, but also using social media as a tool, for instance, in weather warning verification. To develop interpretation aids for forecasters, so going beyond looking at communications from just providers to users, but looking at communication between forecasters themselves. Recently, we've been focusing on developing post-event case studies, and this is really a cross-cutting activity across the whole high weather project. To conduct case studies of high impact weather events, including the warning process from the initial processing of meteorological data through to forecast production, dissemination, communication and evaluation. And of course, we also have activities centered around the topics of today's seminar on uncertainty and the role of trust, salience and belief in warning response. So, as I mentioned on the last slide, one of our earliest task team activities was to publish and edit a special issue on key issues in high impact weather communication, which was published in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction in 2018. And amongst the papers comprising the special issue, we found that 5 core themes really emerge. The development of impact-based warning systems to support decision making. So impact-based warnings, the idea of basing warnings on the impacts that severe weather can have, rather than just the exceedance of particular meteorological thresholds. On tailoring forecasts and warnings for different users and their specific needs. The emerging role of social media in communication and verification. The wider behavioural, social and cultural and political context in which warnings are used, and really speaking today's topic, which crossed over so many of the papers within this special issue, trust and its interplay and relationship with forecast uncertainty. So I just have here a little plug for the special issue. There are some really great papers that comprise this set. If you would like to access the issue but find that you can't due to institutional restrictions, please do get in touch with me. So, in terms of the special issue, we noted that several themes related to trust and uncertainty emerged here. So questions regarding how should we communicate uncertainty to different audiences, if indeed we should communicate it to all audiences at all times. How do people understand and respond to different representations of uncertainty, be they graphs, maps, verbal statements or numeric probabilities? How do forecast updates and changes in uncertainty across lead times impact on trust in forecasts and warnings? Do past experiences, say, of false alarms, affect trust? Does trust affect responses to forecasts and warnings? So we know that trust can vary amongst different groups, and how does this affect responses to forecast information once released? And can trust in forecast providers exist even when confidence in the forecast may be relatively low? So, I mean, within HIWeather and our task team specifically, these are key things that we're interested in. So many of those who are engaged in our task team are doing research on the communication and perception of uncertainty. And we aim to review and collate findings in this area. However, at present, unfortunately, we don't currently have a lead for this particular activity. So please do get in touch with Sally or myself if you think that you may be interested in contributing to this area of work. Another task team objective, which Amisha has recently come to take the lead on, focuses on conducting a review of the current state of knowledge on the impact of trust, salience, and beliefs on weather warning interpretation and response. So we're really excited that Amisha has come to take the lead on this, and I, for one, am really looking forward to her presentation today. And of course, we welcome interest from anybody who would like to help contribute to and support this review and work. So if, having heard about this, you are interested in finding out more about HIWeather as the project as a whole, or the communications task team specifically, we have a website at hiweather.net and our communications platform at hiweathercoms.net. So please do visit these sites if you're interested in finding out more. And of course, if you have any specific questions, you can contact either Sally or myself. So to conclude, I just have another rundown of the program here. Next, we'll be going to Susan and then Thomas and Amisha. And thank you for listening to this introduction. Hopefully I can back onto Sally now. I can see.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Andrea. So we will need to see if there are any questions coming through in the Q&A. People feel free to ask any questions about the HIWeather program and the communication task team in that chat function there. Otherwise, Andrea's given a really good overview of what we're planning on doing, and as you can see, there are still some gaps that need to be addressed on this topic. So I'll give you a minute or two just in case you want to put any questions in that chat function, and then we'll move on to Susan's talk. I'm loving the introductions, by the way. Everyone has really come from around the world for this, and I can see we've got over 170 participants today. So that's very exciting that we've got such global interest in this. Last chance for questions. Okay, we'll move on to Susan, but in the meantime, we'll keep an eye out for questions relating to HIWeather, which we can come to very soon. Okay, so over to you, Susan. Thank you.
Okay, do you see my introductory slide?
Yes, all good, thank you.
Okay. So I always like to start by introducing myself and describing my perspective, because it tends to be fairly unusual, although there's another cognitive psychologist just among the five of us. But I am a cognitive psychologist, which means that we focus on individual cognition, or how the mind works. And my work in particular has been on decision-making under uncertainty for about the last 20 years or so. It is very applied work. So it's based on field work and collaboration with atmospheric scientists and operational forecasters. And it focuses on communicating uncertainty to members of the public. But the methodology is fairly traditional, it's experimental. So I take simplified decision tasks, bring them into the lab, control extraneous variables like the goals, the reward structure, the background information. So for instance, I might give participants this task: decide whether to post a freeze warning. It's for an agricultural community. Farmers use this information to protect their crops, but you should avoid overposting because this protection is expensive. And then I systematically manipulate the forecast. So half of people get a deterministic forecast, just the nighttime low temperature, and the other half also get a probabilistic forecast. And generally what we find with these kinds of experiments is that people have greater trust and make better decisions with probabilistic forecasts. So because these extraneous variables, the goals, the reward structure, etc., are controlled, by which I mean they're the same for all participants, we can make causal inferences. In other words, we can say that it was because of having that probabilistic forecast that people had greater trust and made better decisions. So there are advantages to this approach. It reveals the factors that influence how individuals understand and use forecast information, and it allows us to make these causal inferences. And it also avoids issues related to asking people directly. And that's because there are a lot of decision processes that aren't open to consciousness. So for instance, people can prefer forecast formats that they don't really understand simply because they don't know that they don't understand them. So here's an example of one of those studies. This is a lab-based study. We bring people into the lab, put them in front of a computer, and it's a simulated road maintenance task. It's really kind of like a computer game. They have to decide whether to apply salt brine to the roads to prevent icing, and it has to be done before freezing temperatures are reached. So it's based on a forecast for nighttime low temperature. In order to motivate them, we give them a virtual budget of $36,000 and subtract from that the cost of treating the roads for one day, which is $1,000. But if they don't treat the roads and freezing temperatures are reached, then they get a penalty of $6,000. Each day they get a temperature forecast for the upcoming night. And then after they've made their decision, we tell them what happened. They do this for 60 trials, and these are based on real forecasts and outcomes that come from the historical records. Finally, we take a trust in the forecast rating at the end of each month, and then when they're all done, we give them a cash reward that's commensurate with their ending balance, and it works out to about $1, this is actually real money, per 1,000 in their virtual budget. So here's what an individual trial looks like. They get the forecast, and then they have to make a choice. They can push the salt button or the not salt button. And this person is deciding to salt, and then we tell them what happened. In this case, the temperature did reach 32, so it's a good thing they salted. But notice that it doesn't match up with the forecast exactly because, again, these are real forecasts with real outcomes. So there are two groups of participants. One group gets just the deterministic forecast that implies that single outcome, 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and the other gets the percent chance of freezing. So half of people also get the percent chance of freezing. And what we consistently find is that people have greater trust and make better decisions when that percent chance of freezing is added to the forecast. So in order to better understand how decisions improved, we plotted the proportion of salt decisions over the percent chance freezing. The blue line are the people who have the percent chance freezing, and the black line are the people with the deterministic forecast. And the thing to notice about this is that when they have the percent chance freezing, they salt more when the chance is higher, when it's more likely, and they salt less when the chance of freezing is less likely than if they just have that deterministic forecast. In other words, there's greater differentiation. So this is a task with an economically rational strategy. It is to compare the cost of treating the roads to the penalty weighted by the chance that you would receive that penalty, the chance of freezing, and that's referred to as the expected value of the penalty. And when the chance of freezing is 16.67%, that's the break-even point when the expected value of the penalty is the same as the cost of treating the roads. So what that means is that from an economic standpoint, you should salt the roads whenever the chance of freezing is equal to or exceeds 17%. So this means that precautionary action is required at a relatively low percent chance. And we're interested in that kind of situation because it's similar to severe weather events where the cost of protecting oneself is less than what could happen to you if you didn't protect yourself. So now I've put that economically rational strategy on the same graph I showed you before. And the thing to notice is that people are not rational, even those with the percent chance freezing, but they are closer to that standard than when that same information is withheld. So then we wondered what would happen if we added in explicit advice, and we thought that that would be more similar to the actual situation in which you would be told for a hurricane to evacuate or for a tornado to take cover. So we gave some participants the advice of this decision support aid that we described to them as an advanced weather modeling system that took into account the weather forecast, the cost, and the penalty, and gave them a recommendation for each day's forecast. What it actually did is told them to salt or not salt using that 17% rule that I just told you about, but they were not told that rule. So here's what that condition looks like. They get the nighttime low temperature and salting is advised. But surprisingly, they did no better than the deterministic forecast alone. In other words, having that advice didn't help at all. So now I've put that line on the graph too. It's the dotted black line. It's a little difficult to see because it lies almost on top of the deterministic forecast. And we dug deeper into the data and discovered that people abandoned they made a decision that contradicted that advice by, on average, the third trial. We tried a number of manipulations, explaining the calculation, telling them that it was a long-run strategy. They weren't going to see it on a trial-by-trial basis. But none of these things helped. So then we added back in the percent chance. So in this condition, they have all three pieces of information. They have the nighttime low temperature, salting is advised, and 20% chance. And this is the condition that did best overall. So I've added that on the graph that I've shown you before, and this is the dotted blue line, and notice that they are doing best. So the point is that advice helps if it's paired with the chance of freezing. So what I've shown you here is that people make better decisions with numeric likelihood. They are reluctant to advise certainty is not acknowledged. And we think that's because people know that forecasts involve uncertainty. So they have greater trust in forecasts that acknowledge and quantify that uncertainty. Adding the percent chance to the advice may indicate that although the likelihood is low, action is warranted because of the potential consequences. We've seen this now in many different experiments. The road salt task that I just showed you, where the most common error is a risk-seeking error. We've also seen it in an agricultural scenario where the most common error is a risk-averse error. We've seen it in more complex tasks when people have three options, like closing the school, delaying school 1 hour, or leaving it open, each one of those having a probabilistic forecast. We've seen it where there are 7 updates for a single event, each one of those having a probabilistic forecast, and still having that information helps. We've also looked at level of education, and we found that people who have a high school education or less benefit as much as people who have a college education or more. And that's all I have.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Susan. Very interesting talk. So everyone can get their questions down into the Q&A function for Susan. So have a little think about that. She's certainly a world expert on this topic. So I recommend that you get in with your questions. Oh, here's one from Mark. Were the participants forecasters or the general public?
They were the general public. So initial participants in our experiments were university students, but later experiments we went online and did an online sample that were more representative.
Great, thank you. Just give people a minute to think up some more questions for you.
I can see one from Paul Gorman here. Has anybody studied when the optimal time is to issue warnings, i.e. how long before predicted severe weather that warnings will be most effective?
Yeah, so that is not research that I do, so I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe someone else on the panel will have that information.
Yeah, perhaps we could come back to that during the panel discussion at the end, and we can have a think about that duration, like lead time, basically. Okay, we've got one here from Bob Goldhammer in the US. Can Susan talk more about the level of education difference in response, please?
Yeah, so after our initial studies, we understand that this is numeric information and it can be challenging for people. So we were a little nervous that our initial studies, because they were done on college students, might not be representative. So we got a broader sample and we looked at a number of characteristics. We looked at level of education, so we broke it down: people who had a high school education or less, people who had some college, people who had a college degree, people who had an advanced degree. And people along that spectrum, each group had an advantage they made significantly better decisions if they had numeric probabilistic forecasts than if they had single value forecasts. We've looked at other individual differences factors like numeracy, working memory capacity, a whole bunch of different things. And what we find is that those kinds of individual differences, like numeracy, for instance, they matter most when we don't give them probabilistic forecasts. If we only give them the single value forecast, then it helps to have higher numeracy. But if we give them all the information, including the probability of freezing, then those individual differences don't matter. Everybody does better.
And do you think that would be the same if the people that you were including were, for example, road maintenance personnel? It's a question from Amanda.
Right. So what we're interested in is the impact of probabilistic forecasts on non-expert end users, because we thought this was kind of the most controversial topic, that people would be most surprised to hear that having these probabilities actually help people who were non-experts. We have tested forecasters. We've done some work with forecasters, especially early on, and we find similar advantages for forecaster decision making, but the whole scenario is slightly different.
Okay. All right, we've got a question from Galatea. It said, thank you very much for the interesting study and talk. How do you actually measure trust?
It's a scale between, I think, 1 and 6, trust completely, trust not at all, and you pick the level that you feel that applies to that trial.
Okay. And so would that have then, you said it's a scale and numeric, would you have the labels on either side, you know, like highly agree, or is it highly trusted, or how would you write that if we were to write our own surveys on that sort of thing?
Trust not at all to trust completely. And initially they were kind of 6-point scales, and now I believe we do it in a continuous slider kind of. It's easier to do it that way now. But we've done it in a number of different ways. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question here from Inga. How big should a group be for a good study, i.e. how many people should participate?
What our rule of thumb is, it sort of depends on the effect size you're looking for, but our rule of thumb for the kind of effect sizes that we see is about 40 per condition. So these are between subjects manipulations. Some people get the deterministic forecast, some people get the probabilistic forecast as well. And we do it that way because there are fairly big carryover effects. So if we were to first give them the probabilistic forecast and then the deterministic forecast that was the same person, they would be thinking about that deterministic forecast differently. So we do these manipulations between subjects. And so our general rule of thumb is about 40 participants per condition. So it depends on how many conditions you're running.
Okay. Okay, I've got a question here from Brian Mills in Canada. Susan, could you comment on how emotion or affect might influence decisions?
So that's a really interesting topic. It's not something that I've looked at until fairly recently, actually, in context of climate change. So I do think it has an impact, but so for instance, in climate change, what the issue that we were interested in was we were explaining to people the delay between the reduction of carbon emissions and the impact, the slowing on global warming, and it's on the order of hundreds of years. And we were concerned that if we told people that they would feel that would impact them emotionally, and they would feel less hopeful about the future and maybe less willing to do things in order to prevent that from happening. So that's the context in which we've been interested in, and I don't have any results on that yet to talk about.
Okay, sure. Okay, I've got a question here from Magnus in Norway. Does the knowledge of the cost-loss ratio matter, since this is often not known in many situations? Do you know about that one?
Right. So the reason that we do that is that we would like to be able to say whether people are making better or worse decisions. So we'd like to be able to say, for instance, that people make better decisions when they have probabilistic information, and it provides us with kind of an accepted standard for what counts as a better decision. In other words, the behavioral economists who initially did this work understand that, and they will say, yes, that does count as a better decision. But we've also done work where we, so I showed you that having probabilistic forecasts helps people to better differentiate between situations that do and don't require precautionary action. And so in some experiments where we don't have a cost-loss ratio to fall back on, we show that effect, that if you have just the deterministic forecast, you do it about the same amount across the board. But if you have a probabilistic forecast, then you protect more often at the high end, less often at the low end. And so that counts as our standard of a better decision.
Okay, thank you. So we've just about run out of time for questions, so maybe I'll choose two more. I've got some great questions coming through. I've got one here from Jeff Lazo, who I believe is in the US. Said, this sounds very much like the type of work from experimental economics. How closely have you tied your work to that work and the very broad range of issues considered there, such as using cheap talk or different ways of framing the uncertainty or probability? And you also said some people aren't rational. Can you explain that a little more? So it's kind of two questions there. I'll publish that.
I think my internet cut out a little bit at the beginning of that question, so I didn't hear the beginning of it. But I can answer the last part. I said that people are not rational, but what I meant by that was that they don't do the what would be rational under those circumstances that I just described to you, which was to salt not at all below 17% and all the time above 17%. Instead, they kind of gradually move up to that. It's called probability matching. So it's what people do. It is, from an economic standpoint, it is not rational, but it's better when they have probabilistic information than when they don't.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And so just to have one more. Okay, one from Dave Jones. Susan, have you seen any users question the data used, or do they simply trust the provider of the forecast or information and therefore the data?
Right. So in these early studies, we did not tell them what the source of the information was. For later studies, so we've looked at issues related to consistency, for instance, how consistent sequential forecasts are between one another. And in those cases, we identify the source, and they're all fictional sources, but we identify the source because we want to know whether consistent sources are trusted more than inconsistent sources are. And we do see a difference there.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Susan. You've done a wonderful presentation and answered those questions superbly. We'll store a couple of those other questions there so that we can ask them during the panel session as well, if we hopefully get time. And I did notice some of the other questions as well that popped up during the talk, and I've taken a note of them about HIWeather, so we'll get to those as well. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Thomas Cox from Germany, and he's going to be talking about uncertainty and trust and warning response by emergency services. So we'll get his presentation up as well while Andrea sorts that one out. And keep the questions coming, people. Feel free to keep them ticking over. Okay, thank you, Thomas.
Hi, everyone. And yes, my screen is online. Good evening from Europe, and thank you very much for having me. I would like to talk about warning response from an emergency service perspective. And please keep in mind the German context of these presentations, and maybe we can discuss transferability to other regions, other countries later. Yes, let's see about that. Let me start with the answer to a question we asked emergency managers in a 2014 survey about a hypothetical forecast probability at which they would start with preparatory action. And as you can see here, 55% of the emergency managers would only start taking action if a forecasted severe weather event would exceed 70% probability of occurrence. So why do emergency managers do not want to act at an earlier stage of time when the probability of an event is still low? And although we could think, this is the assumption by some researchers and national weather services, that a gain in lead time enhances preparedness and the adequate allocation of resources. So this kind of results require a deeper look into the interpretations actually of uncertainty, what we saw in Susan talks already, and the actions taken by the warning recipients, and that's what I will show you in a couple of minutes. So first of all, preparatory measures are prepared to respond, and the aim is to ensure and maintain the organization's ability to act. So they allow the organization to respond to an event, and most measures are therefore taken to avoid any surprises and disruptions of the workflow. And once those organizations get the weather warning or forecast, they start with observation of the weather, including consultation of the weather services, maybe the regional offices via telephone, and ask for more detailed information. And this is therefore one of the main issues which follow up a severe weather warning. Some warning recipients act as gateway to other institutions, and they simply forward warnings internally or to subordinated authorities. Especially command centers are a typical warning recipient that act only as gateway, and it's not necessarily the one to undertake measures on the ground. And we always have to keep this in mind when we talk about, oh, what are we doing? What is your response? What are you taking for measures? Other measures can be grouped into personnel measures, like extending the length of services, calling up off-duty units, or the creation of crisis management groups or emergency task forces. Or non-personnel preparatory measures, including the deployment or relocating of technical equipments and vehicles. But during a series of workshops together with representatives from different key organizations, mainly emergency management organizations, we derived a set of requirements that those users ask for. First of all, as weather is not restricted to administrative borders, emergency managers have a strong request that warnings recognize their spatial and temporal needs. Some experienced users, such as firefighters who receive weather warnings daily, prefer an intensification of warnings, meaning warning level and the time between the information when the event is nearing. Meaning they want to receive a notification with low probability and subsequent information with higher probability and more detailed weather information later. Additionally, emergency managers working mostly during or right after a severe weather event started, they state that weather information about the current intensity and the expected end of the event are vital to and could help structure their operational practices right as the event happens. Precision in space is slightly favored over lead time by emergency services, water management, and other users. But for instance, road maintenance prefer earliness to precision. Especially when warnings indicate just low probability of occurrence and are forwarded internally through the emergency management chain, emergency managers are cautious as they expect that their staff pay less attention to warnings in general when they receive them too often. So what we mostly know under the term of cry-wolf effect. As a lot of emergency services in Germany and worldwide rely on volunteers, emergency services also feel loss in the employer's willingness to excuse their employees for voluntary services during working hours if warnings become more frequent in general without having visible impact in the respective area. They assume that people need to be able to verify warnings for themselves to a certain degree in order to keep believing the warning information they are given. On the other hand, some firefighters made interesting comparisons to fire detection systems. And here you can see one of the quotes from our surveys. It is common practice to respond to a fire detection system within the necessary power of force as if there is a fire, although in many cases detection systems give false alarms. The consequences of not responding to alarm will be too costly. And this attitude is comparable to the treatment of weather warnings, and exceptional cases may lead to a very preemptive approach to deal with uncertainty. For most emergency managers, relevant information is information on impacts that can be expected, especially if the organization does not have the capabilities to derive a potential impact from their own statistical models or past experiences. As they are mostly reactive in coping with severe weather events, the impacts are of more concern to the emergency managers than the weather event itself. Or, as you can see here in the words of firefighters, the impact is not the precipitation itself, but flooded basements, overflown streets that cause the disruption to the organizational routines. Emergency managers told us that detailed information must be accessible and suitable for everyone within their organization, and any hierarchy and knowledge levels between the users should be avoided. And at last, technical requirements are numerous ICT-related issues that I don't get into further detail here, but to sum it up, it's more about the failure resistance, redundancy, and fallback solutions. So how can weather warnings cover the various emergency managers' needs? And one way to aid users to better conceive weather warnings is by providing impact information like traffic disruptions, fire missions, and others, and compare them with similar events from the near past. It can be linked with probabilities of past and current weather events, resulting in some kind of local impact climatology. And I just want to point out one of the various points which are currently discussed under the term impact information. And this is that some emergency managers formulate their concerns about how to handle conflicting information from officially and non-official sources, which they worried could lead to a problem of operational decision-making, as reliability of sources is hard to assess quickly right during an event. So they often prefer their own staff on the ground to act as information source on local impacts. The second point I want to raise is cooperation. Emergency managers see the personal contact to a regional weather advisor with local experience as very helpful for their decision-making to explain forecast uncertainties and dissolve misunderstandings. And there are several good examples around the world on cooperation, and I skip that. But let me pick here just one other point of discussion. And this is that if we take cooperation seriously, then the receiver's role would shift from a pure user to partner and collaborator, and with all the rights and obligations that will follow from that. And maybe we can discuss this later. So to sum up, be transparent and open about the uncertainty in weather information. Communicate the consequences of weather. Establish good collaborations between the forecaster and key users that helps to understand mutual needs and enhances trust. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer some of the questions. Back to you, Sally.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Thomas. So we have a question here from Dave. Is it concerning to weather officers at all to have emergency managers provide weather briefings to their colleagues or others? Do you find that some impacts or specifics might be misinterpreted?
So that the impacts are missable. I have to think a little bit about this question.
So I guess it's if emergency managers were to communicate their own weather information or have discussions amongst themselves, is that concerning for the meteorologists or forecasts?
Yeah, that's actually a hard question. It's the question who's the leader in a discussion, right? It's like who's the one to say the final word. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that people always talk about weather, and so not only the official information of the source that they receive, but people watch out the window, they go to work, they experience weather, and they have a kind of feeling what is going on. So, and they will talk about it. So, and they might have already experienced the impact of weather on their way to work. But this all definitely has some impact on decision making. Can that be a conflict? Yeah, could be. It's difficult to answer. I have to think about it.
I suspect people's tacit knowledge and their own experiences probably influence their decisions quite a lot, as you say. Okay, next question is from Beth Ebert in Australia. In Germany, do emergency managers and weather forecasters sometimes work as a team, i.e. in the same room?
No, not that often. So not during routine situations. There are situations, for example, when you have a specific outdoor event, like let's say a huge festival, music festival, where the organizer might have a meteorologist on board, mainly coming from private companies. But emergency managers are one of the prior customers to the weather service, so they always can call them and ask for more advice. And in Germany we have different regional offices, and they are responsible for one or more of the federal states. And so during the daytime, they always can call them and ask for further advice. And that's what we have experienced during our studies, that they do it, and they ask for, let's say, mainly it's about as I said, about the current ongoing event or about the end of the event. So, for example, if, let's say, there is a winter storm coming up and it's snowing and it's 8, 9, 10 o'clock in the evening, and so one of the firefighter forces are going home. The next shift will start, and now one of the commanding firefighters might be interested in knowing when will the event stop. Will it continue to snow during the whole night? And especially what's about the next morning, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning, all people going to work, there will be more traffic, there might be some accidents, and this is when I need my people to be on board. So I don't want to have them all out now, and then I have to send them home because they're tired. And then in the next morning, everyone wakes up, sees this snow, and there might be some impacts. So this is very crucial to their decision making, and that's one of the typical situations where they might take the telephone and ask a meteorologist for help.
I think that partnerships between the different organisations involved is really a crucial discussion when you're talking about trust and uncertainty and that sort of thing. We've got a question here from Diana. What issues in terms of organisational differences and requirements, cultures, etc., do you see that need to be overcome to facilitate effective communication and coordination between forecasters and end users?
That's a very good question. So we've looked into different organizational practices and specifica, and one is lead time, definitely. So there's the firefighter. They are always ready to work. That's in their habit. So they're sitting in their cars, in the trucks at the fire station, and then they get alarm, and then they get out and respond to it. And then there are, let's say, crisis communication coordination groups or task force. They need several hours to group together, and maybe even longer. And so there's really a huge difference on what kind of organization you're talking about. So that's one of the issues. So that's lead time. The other one is there can be several. That's you have kind of organizational cultures. So how people really want to work, or what they think, how they can handle situations. So, for example, we looked into volunteer firefighters, and we had situations where they were actually a little bit upset that nothing happens. So because they signed up for being voluntary firefighters, then there's an event coming, and they say, yeah, I can help, I can work, I can dig some snow or cut some trees or whatever, and then nothing happens, and then they're really upset because they have to go home and nothing was going on. So it's maybe strange for people thinking about that, but it's some of the within the culture of firefighting. It's more about really like going out there and working. So that's one of the issues as well.
Do you think that those emergency responders going out like that, would they want much detail on the forecast, or do they, like, as in detail about uncertainty, or do they just want to get the headline risk, do you think? It's a question from Linda.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it depends, as always. So we've seen a lot of firefighters who don't want to receive that kind of information. They say, if there is an alarm, I go out with full force of power, and I don't care how uncertain the information is or not, because if I don't go there, then it would be my failure. It would be my mistake. So I go there and nothing happens. For me, that's fine. And so going back to Susan's presentation, for example, they don't have this kind of cost-loss ratio. They don't think in monetary values. They just think, for instance, in saved lives, for example, or even political reputation. So it's very important to go out there and help. But then there are others who think about this, and maybe they have less resources available. Maybe they have to think about shortage in their staff or something like this, or in equipment. And they definitely think about, okay, let's see, okay, how certain are you with this information, and how far can I go not to respond to this or that? And yeah, maybe the last thing is very important. It's always about this responding, and this maybe relates to the question before as well. Is that, from my understanding, is that the culture of firefighting is very responding to an event, and this is not really proactive. And we can see some changes there, but other places we can't see them. So that's really an issue which might change with new ICT and models available for them, for their decision making. But deep down, they are very they're responding to events, and they're not proactive. Okay,
cool. I'm going to change tack a little bit now. I've got a question from Armel. How does the German Met service, DWD, manage to predict impacts per se? Do you have an impacts database continually updated and referred to in an analog way for future events resembling previous impactful ones? Great question.
It's a very good question. I think I'm not the the best to answer that because I'm not from the German Weather Service. For as far as I understand, there's no such database available at the moment, and it's a big question. And it's a lot about privacy issues. It's a lot about where to store, who has access to it. There's research, and I presented 2 examples on my slides about, for example, traffic incidents at FU Berlin. Colleagues there working on this issue, and there's research, for example, on impacts on fire brigade missions. So how many weather-related fire brigade missions are there with respect to certain events? So the data is available somewhere. So someone has made a record, someone has written it down, but it's not available publicly, obviously, but it's not available for the German Weather Service either, because it's either a local community data or it belongs to the state or to another authority. And so there's work on it, if it makes sense to use it, but at the moment it's not operational.
That sounds pretty similar to, in my experience, to many countries around the world, starting to gather that impact information, but perhaps it's not quite in a robust, usable database as yet. And that's going to be quite important when it comes to issuing impact-based warnings, as advocated for by the World Meteorological Organization. So I've seen in quite a few papers how there's a bit of a call for those impact databases to be really built up and ready to go to be able to issue those impact-based warnings in future. Okay, thank you, Thomas. There are a few more questions that I'll publish and put into the Q&A function if you want to try and reply to those directly.
Sure.
Otherwise, for timing, we're going to move on to Amisha now. So Andrea will get her contact ready to go and I'll publish these, and over to you, Amisha.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just getting the slideshow sorted. Hopefully you can all see that okay. My work has predominantly been from an agency perspective, and interestingly in that context, there's certainty when an event is either imminent or a few days away if a flood is predicted. And in that context, a lot of our communication advice is to lead with behaviour-oriented messaging. So evacuate now, stay informed, prepare to evacuate. So it's really fascinating to take the shift and look at weather warnings where there is uncertainty about what might be happening today. And those of you in Australia, in Queensland, the area that I'm from, our state, we've been warned of severe weather, thunderstorm, heavy rainfall, hail today as well. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out and the communication that comes as a result of that. But today is really a chance for me to share some observations of research around trust, the concept that we all talk about and we all feel and behave around, but in the context of severe weather, and to get some insight and input from you towards a potential research project that we're looking to kick off as part of this group. So I've done a lot of work in trust, and my school is the business school, so I do come from that perspective. Forgive me if that's offensive to some people, but we worked a lot with corporations as well as government, and together with one of my colleagues, Brooke Liu, who's based at the University of Maryland, we did an audit of research from government in risk and crisis communication. It felt like doing a PhD all over again, let me tell you. But we analysed a lot of articles from multiple contexts, and I wanted to share that overall, we see trust researched, we see trust measured, but we don't always see it defined. And there is a really critical difference in how some definitions of trust. And the most common definition in the natural hazards domain was actually around social trust, which mimics some of the more managerial definitions of trust that you may be more familiar with. But this is an example of Siegrist's definition for social trust. And when we look at how trust is conceptualized and measured, there are likewise multiple theories that researchers will signal to or reference when they're talking about trust in the context of their research. But we find differences with how they're measured. So some will use a single item scale, others will use multiple scales, and those of you who are familiar with some of the management researchers will also talk about the notion of trustworthiness as a driver for trust. And so we'll measure trustworthiness factors as well as trust items. But we're also seeing, and our colleagues today on the panel have looked at trust in the forecast or trust in information, and the notion of trust in others, whether we have trust in others, generally community, to support some of the decisions we might be making and support our safe outcomes. But when we look at the specific measures that are being used, there's some general item anchors like, do you trust? Yes or no? And then more deliberate ones or definitive ones around confidence in technical skills of risk managers, just giving you an example here. But overall, because there is quite a bit of variation in how trust is measured, but then differences and or absences of the conceptualization of trust, it's hard for us to get a full sense of where we are at in terms of weather and severe weather warnings. So what we are looking to do is really try to leverage that for our project. But to give some context for how we've looked at trust within the severe weather context, I wanted to look at what are some of the antecedents of trust and then what are some of the impacts of trust, which I've conceptualized here on this slide for you. So the researchers today have looked at forecast inconsistency, the severity of forecasts, perceptions around forecasts, in addition to other variables we would often use, risk perception, comprehension or knowledge of events or weather, and certainty. And all of those factors can influence trust, either trust in the organisation or trust in the forecast or information. And trust, if we look at the impact of trust, it can likewise influence risk perception, but also people's protective action intentions, which could be seeking information, sharing information, but also following any guidance or instructions that might be part of the content there. Some of the research that we've just done also shows trust linking to affect, which can subsequently lead to protective action intentions as well. So I guess trust is complex, and but there is a lot of call in the literature for us to not overcomplicate how we treat trust, and to remember its kind of origins and how we would use it in an interpersonal setting as well. Trust is also influenced by the differences, individual differences, so and also geographic differences in some of the research. So and culture can play an influencing role there as well. And a lot of that research is more from overseas audiences than it is from Australian audiences. We tend to trust a little bit more in Australia at the moment. I'm not sure what the read is like. Victorians might have a view on that, given our current COVID environment. But that there are some national differences and international ones to be mindful of here as well. So where I wanted to land today, and really happy for there to be a lot of questions around this, and you know, critique it as much as you'd like. We want to try to move towards some consistency on definitions, theories and measures to support ongoing research. Now, that certainly doesn't mean we just want a siloed view on things, but to enable equivalent understanding of research and findings we believe that moving towards that would be more useful for us to gather that maturity as a field in this area. And critically, I'm quite an applied researcher as well. So to be able to support our meteorologists and forecasters to look at information and how information and content might be presented to support. Generally, I'm community oriented, but thinking about Thomas's presentation, perhaps it's also you know, that interface between weather agencies and emergency services organisations too. So a couple of our proposed research questions for feedback is, how do high impact weather warnings currently signal trustworthiness? And I've deliberately dialed it to trustworthiness as an antecedent for trust, because it gives us the content, the ability to look for that content. So of some elements of trustworthiness that we look at from a management point of view are competence, integrity, and benevolence, but there are many others that are considered within the risk literature as well. And the second research question is, what are the components of high impact weather warnings that create issues for or enable trust, risk perception, and protective action intentions? And I note all of that because I guess we want to look at what is the value of trust and its influence on our end user, whoever they might be. So a deliverable from this piece is a conceptual model, or maybe even we maybe even do some empirical research to support our meteorologists and forecasters build trust as in the lead up to high impact weather. Also really keen to understand what high impact weather options are of interest to the team. So in Australia, we tend to talk about bushfires or wildfires and you know, severe flood or flash flooding kind of events, but happy to hear other options there. So that was it from me in terms of a presentation, but I might keep this slide option up and then happy to shoot to questions, Sally, if that's
perfect. Thank you very much, Amisha. That's really interesting. Okay, well, while people get questions onto the Q&A chat function, I've got one from me. What do you think are the most important things Met officers should consider when building or maintaining trust with forecast recipients?
One of the things we've been speaking about is showing a little bit more about the data that's informing the decision. We've seen in the public health context that when a recommendation or information is being put forward, understanding the process that leads to that decision is a critical driver to help people know which one to believe, especially if there are differences that are coming through. I think that's useful. In Australia, we have our Bureau of Meteorology, which we call the BOM, and you know, even my 6-year-old knows to Google and look at the BOM radar. But there are also other weather providers or translators of weather content too, and I think some of the others can be a little bit more definitive in what they want to do or provide an interpretive lens, which could be usefully considered by our bureau as well.
Okay, thanks, Misha. I've got a question here. Do you have any comments on how many false alarms does it take to lose or diminish trust? And I know this is a massive topic and it's of high interest to a lot of people. So do you have any insights on that?
I don't, alas. I don't have a number. I know that, so I don't want to throw to you too horribly, Susan, but I know you've done some work around false alarms in this context too. I don't have the magic number for you, but what I can say is we completed a study in July this year, and we specifically looked for message fatigue for bushfires and flood events, and it's quite a low. There's low levels of message fatigue for those two hazard types. if that helps.
Yeah, my understanding is that the context does matter, including past experience and people's proximity to the hazard and things like that, and where you are in the season. So I think Brenda Mackey from Australia's work has shown that, I'm sorry, Brenda, if you're listening and I get this horribly wrong, but the earlier you're on in the fire season, the more people are okay to take false alarms, but then as they get towards the end of the season, you know, they're not so willing or something like that. So there's a lot of context that goes on. But my understanding is that forecasters, and this is across all hazards, can hesitate a little bit to put out these warnings just in case it does end up being a false alarm, a false positive. But in reality, people's perceptions aren't actually that bad. People are still willing to actually respond to the warning just in case they're going to get impacted, and therefore there shouldn't really be that much hesitancy to issue these warnings. Yeah, I don't know if any of our other panelists have anything else they'd like to say on that matter about warning fatigue while we're on it. Feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. No willing participants. Okay.
I can.
Yes, Thomas?
Yeah, maybe just one comment I had it in my talk as well, is that I think that a lot of people are afraid that there will be warning fatigue, but when it's that's really depending on the severity of the event, and when the event is severe enough, you don't see a lot of warning fatigue anymore. So these little events which come up too often, they tend to annoy the people, and that's when we talk to a lot of people. They say, yeah, that's something that annoys me. But when you ask them, oh, could you want less information? They say, no, please keep me up with the information. So there's yeah, that's something I would say it's not that easy to answer. It is. If you ask them, do you want to have more information? They say yes. If you ask them, and is it too much? They say yes as well. So so it really depends on what decision you have to make. And I think one of the issues, maybe I just skipped through try to answer some of the questions coming up in the Q&A panel. And I think one of the issues, really main issues, is that we are talking about really severe events around the world, and because we have like a global audience here, it's about hurricanes and floodings now there, and we talk about winter storms, and then we have some really small but ticky, itchy events which can impact an organization or an individual personally and affect them, but it's just about the decision if I'm getting wet from the rain or whatever. And I get a thunderstorm warning and it's not happening, but so what? It's not a big problem. So that's one of the things I think we have to always keep in mind, that it's the weather event and the forecast can mean something totally different to all people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you very much, Thomas. Okay, Amisha, we'll move on to another question. Got one here from Deanna. How do you see economic or social statuses impacting trust levels, and what strategies have you seen as being effective in mitigating trust and engagement issues?
So yeah, I haven't seen it with economic in terms of what we've read in the literature, but there's certainly social around different cultural populations or ethnic backgrounds will have an influence on trusting, but ways to counter that have been to take a more localized view to trust and using alternate kind of spokespeople from the community to support the messaging. And you know, you probably have seen that a lot with COVID-19. We saw a big shift with some of our regional hospitals from the whole of government or whole of state message to seeing the doctors saying, you know, we're here to protect you, you stay at home. Those kind of using the different voices, I think is a critical way to try to counter some of those perceptions around trust.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question here from Jen Henderson. So this is about the definition of trust. And do we need to be consistent across the different, different projects? Is it that the context and the different theories and approaches might mean that a different definition of trust and the way we measure it is legitimate, rather than striving for consistency? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I hate seeing everyone be the same, and I'm not suggesting for us to all be robots with what we're doing, but trust has different definitions, and when you look at them in detail, some will talk about a willingness to be vulnerable to another party, and others won't consider that piece. Others will consider vulnerability, but then look at that in terms of the absence of being able to monitor somebody's actions. So I think that level of depth is critical to be able to work out what your philosophy for trust is for any project. And some will be quite functional about whether trust is there or not, and others will take a more nuanced view. So I think it's whatever it is you choose to do, that there is a reflection up, and there is that alignment up and down with the research, rather than just taking for granted that we know trust and we assume a knowledge about trust, but making sure there is that aligned application would be my recommendation.
Okay, cool, thank you. And one final question for you from Chris Noble. Will you investigate the role of government in supporting trust? So, for example, in backing the one authoritative voice, or in mandating its use for warnings, for example?
I think it would be useful to do that in high impact weather, and I'm giggling because it also depends on how different countries or states, territories communicate about high impact weather events. We tend to see in Queensland, but also in other states in Australia, that whenever there is a high impact weather, our Premier will communicate, then it will be backed up by a uniformed emergency services commissioner, and then we'll see the Bureau of Meteorology offer a perspective as well. So there is that kind of coupling of sources and positioning around that, but I think it would be useful to tease out some of the differences, but we do know from our work that politicians are, less trusted, and other researchers have also found that, than a uniform. But our bureau team don't wear uniforms. I'm not suggesting you should, but there is a distinct authoritativeness that our community members perceive with the uniform. So I think it's almost a contest in some ways, but yeah, considering the different sources is important.
Awesome, thank you so much, Amisha, I appreciate that. So we've got about 8 minutes left to have a bit of a panel discussion, so keep the questions coming. We've had some really good ones, and we'll make it to the wider panel now. So we've got a couple here. And it's talking about, there's one from Renee, in light of COVID and Black Lives Matters, how do you incorporate legitimate distrust of the public and government, which extends to weather agencies? I'm wondering if anyone has any comments they'd like to make on that. Amisha, do you want to have a try at starting with that?
I think when it's interesting, one of my PhD students is looking at the notion of distrust and starting from that position of distrust rather than from the positive position of trust. I think it's important to acknowledge that there are different perspectives that are out there, and in some cases a distrust is very much part of the personality or the individual, for valid reasons, but acknowledging those differences and kind of constantly talking about the facts. I suspect we would see it less in a natural hazard context than we would in a more social context. So I think in some ways the natural hazards risk communicators are buffered by that, but how that leads to other things in a public health context with vaccinations and can be a challenge. We do see in natural hazards people choosing to stay in their home when a flood is in their area, So, you know, certainly you see the non-safe or non-compliant messaging and responses, but you know, I don't think we can ever expect 100% compliance. I think we just have to acknowledge distrust is going to be there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm not sure we're ever going to get 100% compliance, so I think, yeah, it's good to strive for, though.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question now that I'd like each of our panelists to answer, if you can. I think we have probably a lot of people who are joining us today who just kind of want to know, should I be putting uncertainty into my weather warning or not? And so in a nutshell, do you think forecasters should include uncertainty in their weather warnings? So we'll start with Susan.
Can you hear me? My answer is simple. It's yes, I think you should. And as we've shown in a lot of research, having a number that you can assign to it really helps. I know there are many, many situations where that's not possible, but I think that acknowledging uncertainty is really important for users to trust the information that you're giving them, because I think we've shown in many studies that they have all sorts of intuitions about this. They don't expect for forecasts to verify exactly. They think that extreme forecasts are going to verify closer to normal values. They think there's more uncertainty the further into the future you go. So they have all sorts of intuitions about this. So I think having valid uncertainty information not only increases trust, but it provides users with information that they can apply to their own decisions, so that they can make decisions tailored to their own situation.
Yeah, I agree. All right, thank you very much, Susan. Thomas, would you like to go next?
Yes, I can keep it simple as well, because my answer is yes as well. And I would just add to Susan's remarks that I think it's very important to be open and transparent about any information you give out. And this is also includes uncertainty of a forecast, for example. So I don't think it will enhance trust. It will allow the user to have to make the decision based on their own experience. And but maybe to add, I think it's important to have like a kind of guidance, so that if people cannot understand what it's meant by this information, they can ask someone, ask for clarification, ask for better understanding. And in some situations, it might not be necessary to give a very long and full text with a lot of details, because it's quite easy to understand that you don't need that much of detail. And then you can, you can just leave it with a simple message. I would say it this way.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Thomas. And Misha.
I support the points that Thomas and Susan have made. Communicating uncertainty is critical, because we're not just looking at weather as a situational event, but a long-term relationship with whoever our end users might be. And to give a slightly different kind of view, we had seen a few years ago where a forecast was delivered as being, this is going to be a 10 out of 10 storm affecting this urban metropolitan area, which led everyone the next day to prepare. You know, everyone was cleaning out everything and taking time off work to prepare for this storm, which didn't end up hitting that area, but hit another area. As we know, weather has unpredictable elements to it. But when you lead with that level of definitiveness, I think it can be a real challenge. So balancing the uncertainty, and again talking about this is how we come up with these data, is a useful option.
Thanks very much, Misha. So we're just about at our wrap-up time, and I know there is so much more we would like to say about this topic, and just want to point out that there are a lot of experts in our audience. As much as I don't like using the word audience as a communicator, I'd rather the two-way conversation. So if there are people online that know of particularly good review articles on the topic of communicating uncertainty and the role of trust and beliefs, or they've done the research themselves, or you just have a favorite document, you know, whatever. If you want to put that into the Q&A function so that people can look at it, or we could use it for our review even, that would be really useful as well. So please feel free to pop those into the Q&A. We can hold this session open for a few more minutes to make sure we can publish and collect all of those, and they'll be in the recording as well for later looking at for anyone. So this is the first in a series of webinars that are being held by the HIWeather program. The people that have registered for this event will be emailed the link going forward for each of those individual webinars. So feel free to pop along to those if you want to. There are also workshops that are going to be held on the 1st, 2nd and 3rd of December. The 1st of December is on citizen science. The 2nd is on the value chain and end-to-end warnings. And the 3rd of December is towards the perfect warning with an emphasis on partnerships. So I invite you all to submit abstracts to present at any one of those workshops. If you email Martin Wegman from the WMO, who emailed you the link to this webinar, you can submit your abstract, say which workshop or date you want to attend and what your preferred time is, and specify the time zone. So for example, you'd put UTC in there. And there are good time zone converters online to help you do that. So if you submit your abstract, we can let you know what the program will be for those workshops, but I invite you all to come along to those too. And you need to do that by the 19th of November, please. Otherwise, I'd like to say a great big thank you very much to our panelists. You've done an awesome job, and thanks to Andrea for co-hosting this with me, and again to Martin for organising it, and especially to the audience for coming along. I know it's very awkward times around the world. It's getting quite late over in some parts of the world, and Amisha will be ready for breakfast. So thank you very much for coming. You'll be sent the recording, and I wish you all the best for your day and night. Thanks very much.